There's been some talk in recent years that the post-World War II liberal consensus is coming to an end. That was the idea that the free and open West defeated fascism on one side and communism on the other to prove that neoliberal capitalism and liberal social values are the way forward. Culturally, this was marked by Francis Fukuyama's book The End of History and the Last Man, the idea being the great ideological debates were over, man doesn't really have a soul, there is no God, all we need now is to work hard for the neoliberal capitalist system and enjoy spending our weekends at the local mall. Yet in an era of mass immigration, cultural stagnation and a crisis of meaning, many have started to question whether the liberal mythology was fundamentally true. Now, normally, the system keeps people in line here by calling anybody who questions liberalism an extremist, you're a fascist, a Nazi, a communist, a socialist, a hater. Yet as the years have rolled on by, such insults have become increasingly hollow, meaningless, and powerless. They speak to an oversimplified, Hollywoodized morality that's struggling to keep pace with the real world. I think this was laid most bare with America's, quote, war on terror. Now, I'm assuming, dear viewer, that you're intellectually nuanced enough to understand that when you explore the complexities of this issue, it doesn't mean you're pro-Bin Laden or pro-Al-Qaeda or hate America. I have to say this because the narrative pushed forward by George Bush and the like in this era was so oversimplified, so Hollywoodized, it turned it into a simple story of good and evil. You may remember him saying that Al-Qaeda and the like were simply attacking America because they hated freedom. Of course, 9/11 was shocking and an absolute tragedy. It was era-defining. But simply to lay it at the feet of just evil for no reason didn't really wash when you looked at the complex historical, religious and economic factors that led to this situation. Bin Laden himself also thought that the USA had a corrupting influence on the Muslim religion. He also didn't like the US backing of Israel. He didn't like the USA meddling in Middle Eastern, or as he saw it, Islamic lands. He didn't like the unjust acts of violence promoted by the West in the region either. Of course, this isn't me saying that his actions are justified. It's me saying that the narratives we're given don't really make sense when you square them up to reality. Second to that, the thoughts of our liberal leaders didn't really match the complexities of the world either. Famously, George Bush and Tony Blair believed that they could carpet bomb Iraq and Afghanistan, and then they would pump the shattered country's embers full of rationalistic, humanistic values such as tolerance and love and equality. They believed that in a few years the Middle East would let go of its silly old ways and embrace pride marches, gay weddings, and a feminist movement that could tell the people there how stupid the men are and how silly their religion is. But for some reason it didn't quite work out. The Middle Easterners didn't want to embrace the end of history. They still had a heart and soul of their own and weren't very interested in what the West had to offer. And then the Western liberals seemed hopelessly naive in the modern global sphere. So the Western elites retreated to revel in the end of history and the liberal world, talking about how wonderful we are, how tolerant, diverse and open, and how those values make a real European. Now all of those liberal values have been compiled and mythologized in one central figure the Western world treats as a sort of secular liberal prophet, that is, Nelson Mandela. A figure like Mandela is the hinge in which the Western world switches from the old world to the new. He symbolizes a struggle against unjust rule of his people, the overcoming of which leads to a new, brighter world of equality, fairness and abundance. Yet as many of you may well have noticed, the Rainbow Nation didn't exactly go from strength to strength. In fact, if anything, it's fallen apart. It's effectively a failed state at this point. It's extremely violent and it's very dangerous. This poses quite a big problem for the liberal system because South Africa should be absolutely booming right now according to its own mythology, but it's not, so increasingly they ignore it. That means there's only two realistic narratives left. On the left, you have the idea that South Africa is still oppressed. It's in this post-colonial state, if you will. However, the liberalist system can't go on board with that because it's essentially a communist argument, not a neoliberal one. Yet on the right, you have the argument that South Africa's in such a mess because they've destroyed the traditional structures that kept the country afloat, they've diminished the rule of law, and they've undermined the white South Africans who had expertise in varying areas for a race communism that's destroyed the country. Of course, the liberalist system can't get on board with that because it would undermine the very values of liberalism itself. So they just have to pretend they don't see what's going on. If there are reports of white farmers being murdered, that's just a far-right conspiracy theory, and deep down many liberals probably think the white South Africans deserve it anyway. As you might imagine, the South African government is left-leaning and black-dominated. That means they take the left-wing narrative. They believe they just need to reappropriate their resources to the black majority, and that will fix things. And that's why South Africa's in the news at the moment. The government there have laid out a decree which states that they can take the land of white farmers and nationalise it and then distribute it as they see fit. Now, as you can see in the BBC write-up here, they make the implication that empowers the South African government's approach. Quote, black people only own a small fraction of farmland nationwide. More than 30 years after the end of the racist system of apartheid, the majority remains with the white minority. As you can see, they're implying that apartheid never really ended, that the injustice is still going on. Of course, that's highly questionable, but there's a reason why the Liberals do this, and it's because they want to keep their mythology alive. If they can keep the idea of apartheid alive, it keeps the Liberal sensibilities alive. However, the liberalist line is on very thin ice here because we have a very recent example to explain why this is such a bad idea. Of course, I'm speaking about Zimbabwe. Famously, Robert Mugabe kicked out the white farmers and basically caused a man-made famine. Now, as you may remember, only a few years ago, the Zimbabwean government called the white farmers back to enhance the agricultural sector. As you can see in this video, they don't exactly seem to be seen as the historic oppressors. It goes without saying that the white farmers had been working on that land decade after decade, and it had been their families for even longer, meaning they had lots of specialist expertise as how to work in that environment. However, South Africa looks like it's going to do exactly the same thing in taking the land from farmers who've been there for decades and giving it to people with no experience. And by the way, there are more race laws now in South Africa than there were under apartheid. So things aren't looking good for South Africa, and with it the liberal system itself. It's also led some to be concerned about the future of the West should the demographics and politics follow that same model. Things are looking especially bad when our cultural elite are going to former colonies and saying silly things such as this.
It's amazing to us that you welcome us even though we are from Great Britain. Thank you for forgiving us for all of the bad things Great Britain has done and welcoming us.
Of course, elites like Chris Martin are everything wrong with modern Britain. The more he tries to seem down to earth, the more he seems detached. And why he's apologising on behalf of all Britons, I don't quite know. And of course, doing this sort of thing just makes us look like we're actually guilty. It gives other people reason to have a racial and political grievance against us, which is uncalled for and unneeded. But people like Chris don't have to worry about things like that. He'll just jet off to Dubai or Singapore if things get too messy. But he does leave London in a bit of a mess, as lots of young people are starting to figure out, although not quite why.
What do you guys think about the safety of England versus Poland?
We all said at the beginning of the holiday that we felt safer here than we did in London, and we can't deny that.
I mean, I've been mugged in London, but I haven't been mugged in Poland.
And why do you think that is?
I think London, it's got a lot of problems. London, it needs.
It's probably overpopulation.
Yeah. But I feel like it's not just a problem in London; it's a problem in Paris, problem anywhere.
Tell us.
No, I'm all good.
Who's committing the crimes in central in London?
Nah, you gotta say
Go on, Simon. Go on.
I think the crimes are committed by people who don't have the opportunities that they should have.
One wonders how much longer the liberal mythology can keep such normies in a zombified state. You'll have to let me know what you think about that down below. Do check out the Substack if you'd like as well. It's all about personal and collective rebirth, and subscribe to the channel if you're new.